Sorry, I thought I muted myself. Hi everyone, and welcome to Coronavirus Conversations Museum Ethics. My name is Rebecca Atkinson from the Museums Association, and I'm going to be facilitating today. As you might know by now, today's webinar is part of a series we've been running examining different aspects of museum work in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as other global movements gaining force in 2020, such as Black Lives Matter. Today's topic of museum ethics is particularly interested in this context, but before I hand over to our chair and panelists to get started on the discussion, I need to deliver a little bit of housekeeping information. Hopefully you can all see the chat function on the menu bar, as well as the Q&A function. It would be great if you could take a moment to introduce yourselves on chat so attendees know who else is in the virtual room. And you can also use chat to discuss the issues raised during the webinar. If you want to ask the panel a question, then please use the Q&A. You can ask a question anonymously, but if you're happy to, then please share your name and organisation. The chair will put selected questions you've asked to the panel, so please keep these short and to the point to help her out. You can also tweet using the hashtag #MACoronavirusConversations. If you have any technical issues or you need to, you can leave and rejoin the webinar at any time. And just so you know, we are recording the discussion today and it will be available on our website later this week. If there are any technical issues, please bear with us. We'll do our best to sort them out. And if you have any issues, please send me a private chat message and I'll see if I can help. Right, I'll now hand over to Sharon to get started.
Thank you, Rebecca, and a big thank you to Museums Association staff for setting up today's webinar, and a big welcome to all of you in the audience. We can't see all of you, unfortunately. There's nothing I'd like more than for us all to be in a room discussing and debating this and networking over drinks. But hopefully you can see and hear us and we'll have a good conversation today. This event is part of the Museums Association webinar series, Coronavirus Conversations, as Rebecca said, and today we're looking at museum ethics. And I think there's never been a more critical time for us to think about our work with an ethical lens. COVID-19 has brought a whole host of ethical issues into focus for the sector. And at the end of last year, the Museums Association's Ethics Committee set a really clear work programme to think proactively about the ethical issues that we might encounter over the course of the next year. And that included thinking about decolonisation, about workforce ethics and ethical sponsorship, amongst other topics. And it will continue to do that work, but obviously we need to take into account the impact that coronavirus has had on our communities and on our museums, and the issues that it's brought to light and to the fore. We also need to consider what the other major events of 2020, including Black Lives Matter and the ongoing climate crisis, might mean for the future of museum ethics. I hope you're all familiar with the code. If not, do please look it up on our website, where there's lots more resources and case studies. We reviewed the code after a major consultation in 2014-15, and I'm proud of the fact that public benefit is the first principle of the code. It can help us guide our work and provide a framework, but it's the thinking and the ethical decision making that we do on a day-to-day basis that's critical. So I'm going to ask the panel to reflect on a number of questions, but you'll get the chance to ask them questions as well through the Q&A function. But let me introduce today's panel. We have in conversation Rowan Brown, the Chief Executive of Museums Northumberland, Allen Grove, National Museum Scotland and the National Mining Museum Scotland. Rowan is now the Chief Exec of Museums Northumberland, the Museums and Cultural Service for the County. He's also a member of the North East Cultural Partnership, the Science Museum Group, Locomotion Advisory Group and the MA Ethics Committee. She says she's inspired by charitable status and obsessed with ethics and making the most of our assets and our talents to serve our communities and change people's lives. Next, we have Neil Curtis, the Head of Museums and Special Collections at the University of Aberdeen. He is a member of the Ethics Committee and a Fellow of the Museums Association, and he says he's passionate about the vicarious thrill that you can get by helping and enabling people to engage with the stuff in order to create an inclusive social world. He says exhibitions sometimes do this, collections and workshops definitely do, and so does repatriation. We have with us also Tehmina Goskar, the Director and Curator of the Curatorial Research Centre, also a Fellow of the Museums Association and Ethics Committee member, who is currently seconded to the Museums Association's Decolonization Guidance Working Group. Tehmina says she's passionate about ethics in Principle 3 of the Code, in particular individual and institutional integrity, which has never been as important to promote and absorb than right now. And finally, we have Jackie Winchester, who's a Senior Officer for Participation at Bristol Culture. She's worked in community engagement and adult learning in museums for 15 years, and before that worked in community learning in the city, including community access to university programmes and courses to encourage greater participation. Jackie joined the Ethics Committee last year and says she's passionate about sharing decision-making outside of museums. So I think you'll agree we've got an absolutely brilliant, talented panel with us today with a variety of experience in different fields of museum work and in different types of collections and institutions. Start with the first question, which is the obvious one. What ethical issues have been brought to the fore? And if I can go to you first, Rowan, for that question.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you very much to everybody at the MA for including me in this really timely conversation. As Sharon alluded to, I am obsessed and inspired by our charitable status, and so for our institution, it really has been examining how we respond to public engagement and public benefit, thinking about what it means to be a charity and how we can respond in support of our immediate communities, be they the local audiences who live just beyond the gates, or our artisan communities and cultural practitioners, and helping to make the most of the assets that we have to help support people through these really quite terrifying and changing times. We've thought really carefully about using the best of our expertise, but trying to reflect constantly on what the salient issues are, and to be in constant dialogue with stakeholders and audiences, and to make the most of the opportunities we have. We talk a lot through the Museum Association, fortunately, about the benefits of engaging with museum services, the impacts on well-being, and in one of our own projects, we've tracked a 72% uplift in well-being and mental health through engagement with our programs. So it's been really important, hard as it's been, to keep on that mission. And that's been a source of inspiration. And I couldn't be more grateful to my colleagues and our board and our funders for being ambitious and helping us achieve things like circus takeovers or practical STEM kit giveaways to get around the digital divide. But a lot of it is about thinking creatively at the moment and being responsive, being that canvas for the people that we serve to make up their own stories and share their own good work.
Thank you, Rowan. That's a really great responding to that first principle of public benefit. And I think we've all in institutions had moments of reckoning over the last 6 or 7 months where we've thought again about purpose and values and how we respond to communities. And I think that is an ethical responsibility. So that it's great that we've centred in on that one to begin with. Neil, can I go to you on that, that issue of what are the things that the pandemic has brought to the surface from an ethical perspective?
Yes, and thanks for inviting me. And always daunting when the glib comment I make by email suddenly is spoken back to me. But I think nonetheless it's true. I mean, that is why I like working in a museum, is that sense of it's what other people get out of it that really drives me. And I think the thing that the pandemic's really brought home is that diversity, and not in a good way. But the way that all the inequalities that there are anyway in society have been really brought home by the pandemic. So it's not that I think that there are new ethical issues that are shown up by the pandemic, and I'd be really uncomfortable if we tried to think of specific ethical approaches to a pandemic. Is more that we've moved in our service hugely online. We've got online exhibitions, online events. We're working with students. and yet digital poverty hovers there in the background. I mean, we've hugely increased the numbers of people we're engaging with, but who's not? And I think some of the things that have come up over the last 6 months or so, and I'm thinking here, like Black Lives Matter, are long systemic issues. And I don't think it's accidental that things have come to the fore during the pandemic, because we're so much more aware of inequality, and it really can hurt and be a real problem. So I think the pressures of work and job insecurity, the way that people are furloughed and those who've not been furloughed have had completely different experiences of the pandemic. Racial inequalities have always been there, but they're even more visible. So I think it's that sort of challenge that we've got of how do we carry on working with lots of different people and recognise how different their experiences are and the inequalities that they have. So I mean, I definitely will stick on number one, public benefit. I think our response, we've got to have integrity in what we do.
Thanks, Neil. And I think that reference to inequalities across the piece, whether it's lack of access to laptops and being in the online world because of lack of access to Wi-Fi or broadband or hardware, or whether it's deep inequality that's rooted and is systemic, is something that has been really exposed during this pandemic, and things that we might have known at the back of our mind or that have just bubbled underneath the surface have really popped up. And we'll come on to that question of then how do we deal with that? What's our ethical response? But for now, can I move on to you, Tehmina, for an answer to that thought about what the pandemic has exposed?
Yeah, I mean, my response really has been just thinking back to where I was and what I was doing at the start of all of this in March, and realizing that this has been an opportunity, I think, for many practitioners to actually reflect on, those real fundamentals of why is it we're doing what we're doing, what good is it doing. And I'd absolutely agree with Neil and Rowan that all of the systemic, the inequalities, the exclusion, the behaviours and attitudes that our code of ethics frame have always been there, but I think the pandemic has sort of telescoped them and magnified them, and certainly magnified some areas, in particular discussions about racial inequality and how that intersects with other forms of exclusion and discrimination. And that's kind of what brought me to really wanting to think carefully about our principle 3, individual and institutional integrity. And I would say it's probably true to say that both as a committee and also as people who sort of train and talk about ethics, that maybe we don't talk about integrity and what that entails as much as we perhaps should or could. And I'd certainly say that all of the things that have been brought up over the last 6 months politically really speak to that principle. And I would love us to explore those further, and also to test whether the points we make in the code are still relevant. Do we need to strengthen them? How do we go about using them so that our colleagues can have the succor and support that they really need right now? So that's kind of what my thought processes have been, particularly around ethics and particularly around principle 3.
Thanks, Tehmina. And that's a really interesting one, because at the beginning of the review of the code, when we were drafting and consulting and came up with those ideas around institutional and individual integrity, that immediately sounds good. It sounds tangible. It's something that should obviously be in a code of ethics. But then when you dig sort of underneath that, you begin to think, what does that actually mean? And what does that behaviour look like at an individual level and an institutional level? And obviously there are points underneath that in the code, but how does that apply in the sector and, interestingly, more broadly in public life? So that's an interesting one for us to, I think, come back to. But can I move to you now, Jackie? What do you think the pandemic has exposed in terms of ethical issues for the sector?
Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, I mean, just to echo some of the points that have already been made, obviously it really shows a mirror to stark inequalities that already exist, that we're already facing on a day-to-day basis. And, you know, there's all sorts of issues around digital poverty and the number of people who don't have access to a smartphone, when we are assuming that, you know, by putting everything online, it makes everything accessible, you know, for a range of people. However, there are examples that I've seen of how, you know, doing things differently, you know, over the duration of the pandemic has meant that, for example, many disabled people have been able to participate in activities that they were never able to do prior to this time. And I'm thinking of, we run a couple of arts on referral courses aimed at people with mental health issues. And I know that from making changes to the way that we deliver those over the last few months, from, you know, we've both been sort of mailing out kind of activities to do in the post, and also running, you know, kind of Zoom sessions for people as well. There have been people who, when they've been in a low mood, have really found it hard to get into town and get to one of our sites, you know, to participate in a session like that, but would be able to, you know, take part in a small group online for an hour or so if they feel up to that. Yeah, so that made me think about, I was at a Curating for Change event earlier in the week that Accentuate were leading, and Kate Smith from Accentuate talked very eloquently about this, and she was referring to an article that Frances Ryan from The Guardian wrote a couple of months ago, where Frances was saying that lockdown has been like an epiphany for her, and that the world has really opened up for disabled people, and she's been able to, you know, view plays that she hasn't been able to see for years, or to take part in virtual tours of museums. And you know, so I think it's about reflecting that, you know, I think Frances said that the world could be accessible and that inequality is actually a choice. So whatever we do will always have consequences, and we need to be more mindful in thinking that through.
Brilliant, and a really powerful and important point. And I know that lots of disability and equality activists have been making that point of the pandemic and the lockdown, that actually it opens up a world of possibilities and potential if access is allowed online and if the cultural offer is shared more equally. So thinking about all of those examples, let's start with public benefit. What are museums doing to kind of tackle some of those inequalities that we have identified there? So thinking about, for example, some of the issues that came out of Black Lives Matter, systemic and structural racism. Does anybody want to sort of begin on that? What is our ethical responsibility, and how have museums begun to talk and speak about that? Rowan?
Thank you. This has been such an important issue over the last few months, and we institutionally, through our senior management team and our boards, and in wider conversations with colleagues, were very intent that we wouldn't put out any statements in response to Black Lives Matter, that we would work with integrity and do what we know how to do as a museum service, which is to tell stories with partners and collections and evidence. And I'm really proud to say that we opened our Dig Deeper exhibition, curated by Norma Gregory, about Black miners in the UK. We opened that exhibition on Saturday, and that exhibition has been in gestation for 2 years to do this work with integrity, and soul means putting in the time and building up relationships. So that exhibition opened, but that's the start of our journey. That's our open call to our communities, so that this time next year and forevermore, we can tell these stories ourselves. One of the things that worries me most about the trends that we're seeing since we opened on one of our sites on the 4th of September. We can't open the other 3 of our museums for various reasons, not least the fact that they don't have toilets or hand washing facilities. But a trend that certainly has been reported by most of the English Museum Civic Network is the fact that the numbers are really changing. There's across the board, there's a drop in footfall, inevitably, but there's a really high spend per head, and there's really high rates of donation and gift aid. So what I'm worried about and concerned about, and what we're tracking at the moment, because we're in the Northeast, that's the area of highest unemployment in England. It's also the area without very good connectivity. So if I lose you, you'll know why. But I'm worried that we're not serving the people who need us most, that actually we're now catering for the culturally astute who just can't get to Venice or Paris or wherever they might have been going this summer, and now they're coming to us. And that worries me. We're funded through our local authority. We're also generously funded through Arts Council and Lottery. But our explicit purpose is to serve the people of our county and beyond. So that is something I'm keeping a really close eye on through postcode analysis. The other thing that we've had the real joy and the privilege to do in the very north of the county, and indeed in the south of Scotland through the Union Chain Bridge project, is try to address some long-standing inequalities through that work. Again, symptomatic of museums. This work has been 3 years in the making. Well, indeed, the bridge was 200 years in the making. But what we're trying to do with that is twofold. One is to, in a way, try and create a level playing field in terms of a community of learners by giving families on both sides of the bridge physical STEM kits so that we can start to engage with them. But we know that they all have the same assets at their disposal, which is really quite fun. And the other much more salient point with wider partners who are global is to try and address the imbalance in the history of technology storytelling, which always looks at the West and never understands the work of the East. And we have the oldest vehicular chain suspension bridge in the world, but it's by no means the first. And through working with partners particularly in Japan and in America, we're still celebrating our monument. We're still spending a lot of money on preserving it, but we're rectifying the stories and we're taking that opportunity to look at wider benefits. And I think that just is so important in how we're using what we have. We need to stick to what we know and what we do best.
Thank you, Rowan. That's a really interesting and important point about audiences, because certainly from an ethical point of view, then I would say that one of our concerns at the beginning of lockdown was that we might just see the shrinking back to those that have the cultural capital in the first place, and not those who we've been trying to work with and bring into our institutions and hear their stories and tell, empower them to tell their stories. So that is, I think, still a concern, and that reduction in footfall, I think, has been obviously across the UK, across institutions, and there's been a rolling back of that as well as local lockdowns have taken place. And there's certainly a sense of injustice and inequality between the local lockdowns and the measures that have been put in place. So I think that's something to reckon with as well. Did anybody else want to come in on that inequalities and public benefit question? So what can we proactively do? I think some good examples there about thinking through. Neil?
Yeah, it's just something I've noticed that we've been faced over the last couple of years, that the university's become concerned with the legacy of slavery in the institution. And now talking more broadly about decolonization and anti-racism and so on. And I've been intrigued to see the way that the university as a broader institution sees the place of the museum in that. And I think this will apply elsewhere, that I have more concerns about the collection, because I think that's not in the forefront of people's minds, but we are being turned to as the people who understand how you deal with heritage. And so we've got a different institutional role than I think we used to have because of that different focus the institution's taking. And I mean, that's one thing. I mean, it's maybe not quite directly in the point you're making, but I think the position of the museum within the broader institution is something we've got to be really alert to.
Thank you. We're getting some questions coming through on the Q&A, so thank you people for putting really thoughtful questions through there. We will come to them, but Jackie, you wanted to come in on the public benefit and where we position ourselves now.
Yes, I mean, just coming back to obviously one of the biggest things that's been happening in Bristol in the last few months, the toppling of Colston statue, and then subsequent, kind of demands around sort of anti-racist activity and, particularly around cultural organisations in the city and renaming of public buildings and so on. And a debate about what's going to take the place of the statue, and more generally and widely around kind of how we represent histories in Bristol and tell certain stories. So in Bristol, we're a local authority service, and we've had a very clear steer from the mayor, and we've seen the setting up of the We Are Bristol History Commission that's going to be taking forward that decision about what goes on to the now vacant plinth. And also, really wide brief around kind of how we tell much bigger stories in the city as well. And I think they've got a very clear view that they want to involve all communities across the city, kind of in doing that. So that'll be interesting to see how that kind of pans out over the coming months. Just coming back to what Neil was saying around decolonisation, I think we've had an interesting opportunity around that in our service over the last few months. So we have been working with Black Southwest Network in Bristol to deliver a series of decolonisation workshops with our staff. And because of Zoom, that's enabled, far more staff to take part in that than would ever have happened before. We've had up to 50 people on a Zoom call from right across the board, front of house staff, fundraising, marketing. So that has been a real positive benefit of this time, I think. And it's enabled us to kind of, really get into the nitty gritty of, kind of what are our strengths and weaknesses, and, identifying some priorities that we're going to take forward through a working group that's been established now. And again, I think we've been able to get that buy-in from people that, no way would we have been able to do that a couple of years ago. So that's been a real positive thing.
That's brilliant, and thank you for that concrete example of engagement around decolonising and those narratives in museums. And I think what's really interesting is, as a sector, we've been thinking and talking and acting in the area of decolonisation for maybe a couple of years, perhaps a little bit longer in terms of actual practice. But, these ethical issues come knocking on our door, and it's the public that bring them in. So whenever a statue is toppled, or whenever there's a question about the future of a statue or something in the public realm, inevitably someone will say it belongs in a museum, or it should be in a museum. So that opens up that whole conversation about, well, then is that correct ethically for it to be there? And if so, how do we interpret it? What conversations do we have with our audiences and the public about that interpretation? Does anybody else want to follow through on that point on decolonisation and what, Tehmina, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the work that we've been doing in the decolonisation working group, and that so many colleagues have been doing in the sector, it's really important to say that this has actually been going on for a lot longer than it's perhaps come into focus this year. Obviously partly prompted by the Black Lives Matter movement and more people feeling the repercussions of that. It's the first time I've heard the museum world talking about being actively anti-racist. That certainly has been a consequence of what's happened over the summer. I think it's great that museums are making statements, and some of them are turning them into actions. And from an ethical point of view, I think it's important that we remind people that there's still an ethical framework around decolonising, and so to be really careful about the demands they make on people, what they expect from others, and that it's, no longer right just to say, well, because we've worked with X group or Y group, that means that, we've done a good thing. So I think that the implications and the demands and the emotional demands, particularly, this is placing on particular collectives and individuals in the sector, not just those that are employed in museum roles, needs to have an ethical look at the impact that decolonising work has on those people, because it would be too easy if we were just focusing on the one-way effect of public benefit being an ethical principle, to perhaps forget that there is an implication on ourselves as well. And certainly, and Neil and Sharon, you'll remember this from the working group meeting that we had a few months ago. It's seriously hard and emotional work. So while I think that things have definitely kick-started over this summer in very many very good ways, and it's about so much more than statues, that we really bear in mind that the effect that this work is having on individuals, and that we offer up the support to those colleagues that are undertaking that work. So that was just a response to what we're talking about right now.
Thank you, Tehmina. And I think that is a really important point, obviously, for the MA as a membership organisation, but for us all to consider as, senior representatives of the sector, the impact on our staff, our volunteers, our trustees, those that work in and with museums, of the pandemic, of the Black Lives Matter movement, of the work that's been done to decolonise. There's almost a perfect storm of things happening in the sector, as well as, all of the day-to-day worries about our families, what's happening in society, how it's being managed, etc. And I know that Tamsin, our professional development officer, has done a lot of work and thinking in terms of response and support for our members and people working in the sector in all of these areas. So do, audience, please check out our website in terms of resources. We'll be announcing further support and resources as we go along. But if I can just, I'm aware on the Q&A that there are some questions about collections. I am holding them for a minute because I just want to stay in this area of contested heritage, because it is a political hot potato, and we know culture's a devolved responsibility. So it's very different where you're sitting, Neil, and different again in Wales. But in England, we've had this issue of the ministerial letters and directives to arm's length bodies. We had a good conversation at the Ethics Committee about that, and that gave the Museums Association a really strong steer in terms of what we wanted to do. But does anybody just want to comment on this? Because it would be remiss of us not to comment on that, because it's been such a huge issue. Neil, you could comment from Scotland.
I never like it when I'm meant to represent a country.
You're not meant to represent a country, but you can comment from outside of England.
No, I don't know. I mean, what I was really pleased with the MA's response was that it was not falling into the trap that was being set. That I think this drive to create a culture war is itself a political aim. And I think being alert to that is really important. And I think there are plenty of people who I would completely disagree with in my own politics, but who would agree that you shouldn't have everything in that same politicized way. So I think this, not saying that we are the experts in deciding what to do, but saying that we're actually really good at engaging people and building that debate and doing it in a way that actually leads to a consensus, a bit like what we do in the Ethics Committee. Is about having different viewpoints and discussing them together and coming to what's the best conclusion we can do, rather than it being a right wrong.
Yes, thank you. And I think that's a really important point to make, and also to remember that the point that we refer to when thinking about this issue of the independence of arm's length bodies and museums and others that are in that position is about editorial integrity and the freedom to interpret and tell stories around collections, and that comes under the public benefit point and principle of the code. And I think it's important to reflect and remember that. And as you say, Neil, it's not about us as experts, it's about us listening, hearing sensitively, working with communities and uncovering those fresh narratives, and also holding our nerve, I think, as a point of ethics. Did anybody else want to come in? Rowan, were you wanting to come in on the contested heritage?
Sorry, Tehmina definitely had her hand up before me.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
No, I'm
blinded
that's
by
okay.
a shaft of light.
I think, yeah, in complete agreement with what you've said, Sharon and Neil. I found it interesting. I felt it was sort of coming, given responses from various politicians, for example, particularly homing in on the changes that the National Trust is making and how so many issues have actually become conflated together relating to collections, relating to public purpose. And I think what it also belies is that there's such a gulf of understanding currently between our politicians, particularly the decision makers, and us as a sector in terms of what we believe are sort of social and cultural purposes and what the current government believes our social and cultural purposes are. And I did actually sort of correspond with my MP on this just to raise certain points, and it was interesting to get the response that it gets repeated often and often, well, we can't rewrite our history. And so again, there's this whole kind of muddling up of what they think museums are here to do, i.e. to represent a version of a, in quotes, national story, rather than the much more multifaceted and pluralized way that certainly all the museums I know will go about it. You know, some do it better than others, but most museums understand that basic fundamental sort of curatorial purpose. So I think we've got some work to do to actually try and, yes, definitely hold our nerve, but also to publicly remind politicians what museums exist for. That's just what I wanted to add to that particular point.
Thank you, Tehmina. That's a really good point, that we should be confident of our purpose. And, you know, one of the things that I thought, and I think this is an ethical responsibility at the beginning of this crisis, is when you go in free fall into uncharted territory and something that looks like the big unknown, the thing that you should do is go back to your mission, your vision, your values. And part of our value framework in the sector is our code of ethics. So to go to that, to look at it, and this is an open opportunity in this conversation, to say, as you asked Tehmina at the beginning, is it fit for purpose? Is it right? Do we need to expand? Do we need to develop? Let's begin those conversations. So I'm very conscious that there's a lot of questions coming through. I knew that this would happen. This is great. There's also a side hustle in the chat bar about answering questions, emotional labour, and how responsible or irresponsible it is for us to take walk-ups and the discrimination or otherwise against people who don't book in advance. So there's some really interesting chat going on there. I'm going to take some of these collections questions now. Inevitably, one of the principles of the code is around the stewardship of collections. We have some questions about that. So to summarise, because of the big financial challenges that many museums face now and over the course of the next year, because it's been aired in the press about the Royal Academy potentially or not selling the Michelangelo and the Royal Opera House selling the Hockney, where are we at with the idea of selling from collections? Is it ethically responsible for us to say, don't do that, and then see museums potentially go to the wall? Neil?
Yeah, I've been looking at the Q&A and was interested. I mean, it's the obvious thing, and the history of the Code of Ethics really started with collections. But I think we've got to, start afresh. I mean, the current code did start afresh and has put these, the public benefit and the collections and equal pegging. And then the third one about integrity. I think in a way we can think of that in two ways. One is about our staff and the workforce in museums, and then the other bit is about integrity with a capital I. And really what we're needing to do if we're working ethically is to approach those three headings of the public, the collections and our staff with equal weight in our discussion and approach it with integrity, so that we don't start saying, when I notice that, you know, there's an anonymous quote, so I can comment on it, which said, obviously selling things would be against the code of ethics. I don't think that's how we should see the code of ethics, as saying it's obviously anything. If it's obvious, it's not there for ethical discussion. It's the importance of having a clear set of values and integrity in how we approach those that code of ethics that will answer some of the questions that I'm seeing that are saying, what do we do? Well, nobody else can answer it for you. It's how you approach it. It's the process of thinking through ethics that's so important.
Rowan.
Thank you. Yeah, I entirely agree with Neil. I am a museum professional and I have sold collections. They were disposed of entirely through proper means, and it helped to preserve the rest of the organisation that I was running at the time. I think the fact is we are in unprecedented times, and as Neil so rightly says, we have to consider our immediate picture, how we serve our audiences, how we engage with society, how we fulfill our purpose. I've been thinking a lot, and this is a bit provocative, about 2.10, about refusing to mortgage collections or offer them as security, and just wondering, and I don't have a complete answer, but just wondering, is it better that an institution puts the value of a picture in reserve and it gets it through that next stage of funding, and it buys another 5 years, and it gives the opportunity for those staff to make those collections fly and to connect with communities? Is that better than it being lost and ending up in some private home? I mean, I am very much coloured by the experience of an internship at Christie's in my formative years, and seeing those incredible artefacts and things that we should all be culturally entitled to behind storeroom closed doors and ostensibly lost to a wider public, particularly when the works themselves were created by normal people who didn't ever see the giant price tag hammer price realised. So I think I'm beginning to feel like we might need to reconsider 2.10 and to think about the wider organisational picture. I think we know, because of climate crisis and pandemic, that posterity doesn't necessarily mean 2,500 years. We just have to be more realistic, and that's how we act responsibly with the public assets that we're given.
Yeah, I think that acting, you know, with pragmatism and realism is what we need to do now. And I was struck when you started your contribution, it was a bit like a session of Disposals Anonymous. I'm a museum professional and I have sold collections. And I think we just need to have a much more open debate and dialogue. I see that Ian Watson from Tyne and Wear Museums has said in the chat, I think a bigger issue than selling for many will be the cost of storage, both the financial and environmental cost of storage. I was struck at a seminar that I was at probably 18 months ago with John Finch, who's the chief exec of Bristol Museums, saying and showing the poor condition of some of the storage for some of the collections. We almost can't do contemporary collecting because the stores are so full and the quality is variable, let's say. And yet, look, from what Jackie said, of all the contemporary collecting that could have taken, and I'm sure is taking place this year, but we can't collect at this rate from the point of view of not having anywhere to put it, but also from the point of view of the environment. So there's something in there about maybe reviewing our approach to disposal and being more open in conversation about it. Rowan?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is that collections can have a useful afterlife. One of the proudest moments of my career is working with the wonderful Gilly Burns to send sewing machines to Africa. After we'd done a full national picture of what existed, realised we probably had about 2,500 too many sewing machines, and that actually those could help people earn a living in a different part of the world, and that in itself was an educational point that we could communicate to schools. I mean, I don't think we should think, particularly in a repatriation context, about disposal necessarily being the end of learning or the end of the relationship. It can be so much richer depending on how you do it.
Thank you, Rowan. Jackie, you wanted to come in on this point.
Yes, I just want to say that I completely agree with Ian's point, and also John and I have had conversations about this in Bristol as well, as I expect you can imagine, around, you know, I think it's long been an issue around, you know, where we've got duplication of things, or things that in our case don't relate to Bristol's history particularly at all. And, you know, yeah, what are we going to do with them in the long term? And it certainly does stop us from doing more contemporary collecting as we could be doing. So yeah, I'm fully on board with that as a priority.
Great. And obviously disposal and sale from collections is not the only point at which we have interface between the code of ethics and collections. There are many other ethical aspects of how we work with collections, how we work with communities. And I would again urge people to look at the Museums Association website. We have the Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund, and the whole purpose of that fund is to put together collections and communities, which I hope is an ethical way of working with collections. And there's more funding rounds of that to come over the course of the next couple of years. So do watch out for those calls for applications. So I'm going to move on to a question around workforce, which is, you know, in light of the fact that we, the Museums Association, launched a redundancy tracker just this week, and we've also launched a hub of information for people who are having to make difficult decisions or are subject to difficult decisions. And I know from conversations I've had this week that there are many more potential redundancies in the offing. What could be an ethical approach to some of those really difficult issues that we're going to have to deal with in terms of workforce over the course of the next couple of years? A tricky question, I know. Rowan.
Well, hindsight's a wonderful thing. But I think it's a real shame that at the DNA of a lot of the emergency funding wasn't a condition that required you keeping a certain percentage of your workforce. And I feel very sad about the people whose lives have been affected, the skills that we're losing, how much thinner we will be institutionally without the community that have worked so hard and have worked particularly hard in the context of diminuting public funds over the last 10 years. So I hope that in future rounds, those conditions will be stipulated. And I think Neil made a very good point earlier about how different the experience has been for furloughed and non-furloughed workers. We've tried very hard at Museums Northumberland to keep everyone together, to have opportunities for people still to have dialogue and within the strict confines of the legislation to share and still continue to shape work. And our colleagues have been magnificent in stepping up with things about keeping the morale going. But I feel like our people are what makes our museum. Yes, the collections are our starting point, they're our heart, but without our people, we're just a store. And so it's been a really important responsibility for my board and my colleagues to try and keep us together. But that said, we're a very small institution, and so at the moment we're able to do so.
Yes, and accepting that, you know, different museums are in different positions, absolutely. But that leads on to one of the other questions that's in this area. We can stay in sort of workforce and those who work with us. And that's a question from Kathy G. As a trustee of 2 museums, I'm interested to know whether you think the role or involvement of trustees has changed during the pandemic and whether this has any ethical implications. So that's a really interesting question, because it's not just the pandemic, I think, that shines a bit of light on governance in the sector. It's also Black Lives Matter and a whole host of other issues. Does anybody want to think about that, the ethical role of trustees and any kind of new dimensions around that? Neil?
Yeah, in the absence of anybody else leaping in, it's just more a comment on that I'm interested. I'm trying to categorize what different kinds of museums there are. And we often break them down into, you know, sort of national, local authority, independent university and so on. I'm more struck actually by those museums that have a board of trustees as the museum. And that could be national museums and independent museums, and then those like the one I'm in, where our board of trustees is the university court. And so actually have a vanishingly small amount of their time or interest is for museums. And I think this is where there's a real challenge in how we do engage with our trustees, whether they're close to us and are primarily thinking about the museum or whether their attention is elsewhere. So I'd say it's a bit of a comment on the side, but I think it's relevant in the way there's not one model.
True, and I think there's some, I'll come back to some of the panel, I think there is some interesting reflections around ethics and governance and actually the current state of third sector governance in general. And I accept your point, Neil, there are different types of governance of museums, but certainly it would be my reflection as a trustee and of other organisations, including museums and chief exec, that there has to be a different and better way of working than the traditional model. And I'm really interested in us, when we have Headspace, exploring an ethical relationship between the staff and the audiences and the communities and the trustees of institutions, because it would seem, again, going back to mission, vision and values, that should be the core and the starting point for it. Tehmina, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on this more broadly than perhaps just trustees and boards, but just more generally about decision making and how it is that we have conversations and whether the structures that we operate in are actually appropriate for where we are in the world right now. And again, has the pandemic just magnified an issue that actually has been a problem for a lot longer? Because the independent charity system, certainly in England and Wales, has not been overhauled for a very, very long time. You know, to me, it feels like we're operating in an Edwardian kind of organisational structure that actually creates distance between decision makers, say trustees, and executive, so the workforce. And if we can use ways of working that aren't quite as obsessed with procedure as they are with reaching their vision, like you said, then maybe you know, we can start to change how it is we actually speak with our decision makers, and if we are decision makers, how we are more open to those two-way conversations. And I'd be really interested to know actually whether any museums or kind of museum related organisations are taking a completely new look at how they are actually structured. It's difficult when you're in a legal environment where fundraising is dependent on you having a charity number, for instance. So we do have all of those constraints, but I certainly think that we as a sector, and certainly on the ethics committee, maybe could benefit from talking around how this might work in practice and within our current constraints.
Rowan, were you wanting to come in there?
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. I think just the flip side of Tehmina's Edwardian structures, and much as it pains me to say that there's anything good about digital communications, this medium has actually helped open us up institutionally. So we're in much more regular dialogue with the board. When Norma Gregory gave her curatorial talk to our colleagues, 3 of our board attended. That wouldn't have happened in real time. So although it takes a lot of sustaining, it's really wonderful that they've been so engaged, and they're so much more familiar now with the work and the names, excuse me, of everybody on our staff than they would have been 12 months ago.
Yes, and that integration around purpose and Victoria Piri has said in the chat as well, institutional integrity, including governance at a collective and individual level, is essential in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion. Absolutely. If the trustees, if the governance of the organisation is not on board with that mission, it won't happen. So it is about the relationship, either making the existing relationship work or seeking new forms of governance and new ways of organising ourselves. So I'm going to end on a final question to the panel, which is, what ethical support and guidance will the sector need going forward? We've touched on it, so I'm going to go in reverse alphabetical order. You'll be delighted to hear. So what ethical guidance and support will the sector need going forward? Jackie, can I come to you?
Yeah, well, I'm very much looking forward to seeing, increasingly what comes out of the Decolonization Working Group that Tehmina's part of. I think that's going to be really valuable. And I think also just kind of the more that we can collaborate together and support each other, kind of develop sort of informal networks, to learn from each other, particularly around decolonization, but other issues, that are growing for the sector. So I think it's just, change is messy, and there's no perfect one route to it, and the more that we can learn from each other and talk and share out on kind of how to bring about change and how to overcome obstacles and resistance, which can be an issue, that's all really helpful stuff. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, I think we need to kind of embrace some messiness and a little bit of ad hoc and a little bit of lo-fi and low production, because we can come together in this way. Tehmina, over to you.
Following on actually from what we were talking about in terms of governance and that importance of ensuring that your decision makers are actually on board with what you want to do and what we want to do as a sector. And Jackie mentioned decolonising and the working group that I'm on and Neil is on as well. And I think one of the things that we have come to quite clearly is needing to actually listen to what the sector want more. So if we can have an opportunity to actually do more of our work, perhaps more publicly, and create a longer process out of a process that might otherwise have been shorter, that might help us to understand what it is the sector feels it needs, whether it's, it's ethical, moral support, or whether it's more specific guidance. But I think sort of coming to that conclusion that decolonising isn't just, and this is going to be a big topic in our sector for, I think, a number of years, at least the next 2 or 3, that it's not just about the repatriation side and the giving stuff back, but it's about how we let go of the sort of power and control we've accumulated as museums, and how we see ourselves and how society sees us. And maybe they don't see us as the authority on history and heritage and all that, especially right now. So listening to all of those voices from outside the sector in particular is going to be essential. But I would say to anyone listening or to anyone in the sector, tell us how you would like to be supported, and we can then create those two-way conversations that are a bit more meaningful and a bit more supportive.
Brilliant, thank you, Tehmina. That's great, thinking about power and authority, but also thinking about speeding things up a little bit. We are sometimes ponderous and slow to change as a sector, and it only takes a global pandemic for it to shift along a little bit, and we've all changed practice rapidly. So maybe we can make some of those changes in governance and also to our ethical framework a little more quickly and more fleet of foot next time. Rowan. Oh, sorry, no, it's Neil, isn't it?
I don't mind changing my name. I think we need to think more about, when we talk about our people, who our people are. and be a bit more challenging of that, because I'm so conscious that, we're going to be making decisions where we're pitting the interests of our workforce against our public and against the trustees, that they're not necessarily all in alignment. And I think it's going to be really challenging making those decisions. I noticed one of the last comments in the Q&A was somebody saying we all seem to be agreeing with each other. I would comment that we don't always agree with each other in the Ethics Committee meetings, far from it. But I think it does bring home the importance of, yes, diversity. It's a bit of a cheap word, but I think divergent thinking, and at the same time trying to work to come to, through discussion, to some sort of conclusion, consensus, however provisional. But we need that variety of viewpoints if we're to understand what to do. The final point I'd make is, maybe it sounds a bit trite, but I do like it, that you asked me about from Scotland. Well, one of the thinking ethically, I really like the way that the Mace of the Scottish Parliament has written on it some really important words. There's wisdom, justice, compassion, integrity. And I think they're all, the more you sort of think about those, the more powerful they are. Interestingly, there was a fifth one that didn't make it, which was bravery. And that it really is needed. That's what we're getting into, and we really need to be braver.
Brilliant. I couldn't agree more, and can absolutely witness that the discussions at the Ethics Committee are not everybody agreeing with everybody, but we do usually come to a point of consensus and, after a healthy debate and conversation, and love the idea of bravery as well. I mean, in these times, that is a value or behaviour that we need. So Rowan, finally over to you.
Thank you. Well, I agree with all of my colleagues entirely. I think we, excuse me, bad habits, not COVID. I really think we need a new paradigm for success that really is predicated on honesty. I think we work in a sector where a lot of our funders want superlatives in KPIs rather than the quality of an experience. And I think we really need to challenge that. And I think with that view of the world, I know you're not necessarily going to like this, Sharon, but I do think it is time to revisit the Code of Ethics. It's, 5 years since it was approved, and it is time to look at it in the modern world. I think at the Ethics Committee, it's as much a forum for learning. So we're always desperate to hear from members about case studies, about experiences, good and bad. So do please share, and do please send queries to us. Is it just me that can't see Sharon anymore?
No, we can't either.
Okay.
We'll talk amongst ourselves.
Oh, thank you, Tehmina. I wasn't sure that was for Northumberland.
Sorry, I'll come back on then. Yeah, I don't know where Sharon's gone. Apologies for that. Has everyone answered that last question? Do we get to you, Jackie? Is it? Yeah. All right. Well, do you know what? I'll do the round up and thanks. I'm a little bit earlier than I planned to. She may rejoin us, but yeah. Sorry about that small technical failure. I just want to say thank you, everyone, to our panel especially, and also for all the great questions. Sorry we didn't have time to address every aspect of them, but I'm sure there'll be a chance to pick them up soon, hopefully at the MA's 2020 conference, which takes place online this year for obvious reasons. We're due to publish the programme imminently, fingers crossed, but you can book your place already. Just go to our website and look on the events page. Following that, our next coronavirus conversations is on the 2nd of December, excuse me, and we'll be tackling another biggie, which is what does 2021 hold for museums? You can also book for that event on our events page, and I've shared the link in chat too. So until then, I hope everyone's enjoyed today. Thank you for all the discussion. It's been great. And yeah, sorry for the last minute technical hitch, but hope to see you all soon and have a lovely evening. Thanks, bye.
Thank you. Take care.